So I just got back from the thrift store and I bought this Retrobit Generations game console. It cost me $5, and once you see how it plays games, you'll probably think I overpaid for it. Okay, so one of the themes you'll probably quickly pick up on this channel is I'm a cheapskate. I'm kind of a bargain shopper. I just don't spend a lot of money on my gaming. Most of my gaming PCs are usually salvaged parts from computers that were thrown away or discarded. I do have one decent gaming machine that I put together and built with new parts, but almost everything else is recycled pieces. And I knew going in to this particular review that this particular game console has just an awful reputation, and you know what, I'm going to show you why. It really does play games pretty poorly. This machine was released by Retrobit, and it's called the Generations, and it has a great idea. You know, a lot of retro arcade games were integrated into this game console. Unfortunately, the hardware they picked to run the game consoles just wasn't up to the task. So some of the classic 8-bit games run okay, like the NES emulator is good and the original Game Boy emulation is pretty good, but they included some arcade games as well as some Sega Genesis games, and the CPU they picked for this particular console just doesn't have enough speed to run those 16-bit games. So that's basically why this particular console has such a lousy reputation, is because the emulation is horrible. And you'll notice that there's a lot of stuttering and a lot of choppy gameplay. This game console came with two Sega Genesis 6-button style gamepads, and the build quality is actually pretty good. Another aspect of this game console that I liked was the fact that it had both HDMI output as well as composite AV output. However, this is probably the lowest quality HDMI output I've ever seen. You'll see just how grainy the footage is from the video captures. I don't know how they did the HDMI on this one, but knowing Retrobit's reputation, they probably did whatever was the cheapest possible. The main reason why I purchased this game console is it's got an SD card slot in the back of the machine, and you can add games to it without any kind of modification. It's basically the easiest way to set up like a little emulation box, and it really is a tragedy that this machine really doesn't run the emulators very well, because it had quite a few emulators integrated into the firmware. This thing will run Sega Genesis games, Super Nintendo games, Neo Geo games, Game Boy Advance games, regular Game Boy games, Game Boy Color games, as well as a bunch of different arcade machines. I believe they used the MAME emulator to do the emulation for all those arcade machines. So on paper, this should have been a really great little emulation box. Honestly, I've been pretty harsh and overly critical on this particular game console. If you're going into it like I was, to just play 8-bit games, it does fine doing that. You know, if you just want to play some Super Mario Brothers or Contra on the NES, or Super Mario Land on the Game Boy, or even Game Boy Color, Super Mario Deluxe runs pretty good. That's fine. This machine does pretty well for those tasks. It's just that I can't believe that this machine was built with 16-bit games integrated into the actual system, because it runs them so poorly. So let's power this thing up and take a look at what the Retrobit Generations looks like. The first thing you'll probably notice is the 100 popular arcade games that they advertise in the box are mostly games you've never heard of. And the few games that are really good don't run particularly well on this machine. You know, like I said, your best bet is to stick to the 8-bit offerings on this game console. I'll show you a great example of what I'm talking about. Let's play a little MERCS. This is a Sega Genesis version of the game, and you'll notice how terrible the sound is. The emulation is just atrocious, and I think I'm getting maybe 10 or 12 frames per second. It's really sluggish compared to the original Sega Genesis. Yeah, that was an abomination. I apologize if you grew up with the Sega Genesis, because that's not what you remember. This machine's interpretation of Sega Genesis games is awful. And my recommendation is, if you're playing any of the old 16-bit games on this machine, you probably want to disable the sound, because the emulated music and sound effects just are so off-key. It is rough to listen to. You're much better off just muting the sound effects and music on this game console and listening to the radio instead. And that's kind of what I do. What's funny about this particular game console is, let's take a look at some of these 100 popular arcade games. I know everybody was talking about Lawnmower when I was growing up in high school. We would all sink quarters into Lawnmower and just play Lawnmower all day against our friends. And Street Fighter 2 wasn't a thing. Nobody cared about Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat. Everybody was playing this Lawnmower game. No, I'm just kidding. I never heard of Lawnmower, but I actually think it's one of the better games on this game console, because this can actually run it with a decent frame rate. Okay, so I think I've tortured you enough. I think you can understand why this game console was only priced at $5 at the Goodwill store. The games that come on this thing are so hit and miss, mostly miss. The irony is the shovelware games run well on this hardware, and the games you actually would want to play are so choppy and unplayable, then it's kind of a pointless thing to install them on this particular system. So that's not why I purchased this. Like I said, I read online about how this machine has the SD card slot in the back. So I'm going to show you the emulation. And I've been bad-mouthing this machine a lot, but I'll tell you, the Nintendo Entertainment System emulation, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation, and what surprised me is the Game Boy Advance emulation is actually really good. And I know Hyperkin had trouble with Game Boy Advance emulation, so this older unit does a pretty good job running the games. I was actually surprised. If you're planning to play a bunch of Nintendo classics, then this machine might interest you. The emulation is far from perfect, but at least it's viable on it. It's like the only thing that works properly.
These NES clips are definitely showing the machine in its most positive light. The emulation is definitely the closest for the NES, but that's to be expected because so many people have emulated that machine over the years. The Super Nintendo stuff I didn't bother with. It's even worse than the Genesis clips I'm about to show you. So here's Super Mario Bros. 3. And last but not least, I've got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, which is probably my favorite arcade port on the NES. One of the things I'm going to point out before I jump into the Sega Genesis games is you'll notice the NES is one of the systems this console runs best. Even in that situation, this game console is still dropping frames. It's not a lot, but you can definitely see it skipping frames. You know, the original NES ran the games at like 30 frames per second. This thing is probably averaging like 25, 26 frames per second. So it's skipping a little bit, but it's not the end of the world. It's still a very playable experience. Wait till you see the Sega Genesis that I'm about to play for you. The frame rate drops from the 30 it's supposed to be to probably about 10 or 12. Pay close attention to the sound. The sound emulation is awful, and it's just, it makes your ears bleed. Fair warning, but the emulation's about to get worse. I'm going to load up one of the more demanding titles on the Genesis, Streets of Rage 2. I think the frame rate is dropping down to 8 to 12 frames per second on this one. It's rough, and man, that audio is oof. Okay, so I think you get the point. Even though this game console has emulation for the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and even the Neo Geo built in, all three of those systems barely run on this hardware. You can kind of tweak the settings. You can change the display to original size instead of full screen, and you can turn the sound off and get the frame rates up to maybe 18 to 20 frames per second, but you're still going to have a better experience emulating those game consoles on other hardware, so just don't bother. It's really not worth the effort. Okay, so next up, we're going to take a look at the emulation for the original Nintendo Game Boy. So all the original Game Boy games appear to run perfectly. It's just as good as I remember when I used my Super Game Boy on my Super Nintendo, so I don't see any differences between this emulation and that old console, and I just fired it up to compare, and they pretty much play and sound identical, so the emulation is spot on for Game Boy. Let's take a look at Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color emulation seemed a little choppy compared to the original, but it's still close enough. I mean, the upside to emulating all the Game Boy systems is the resolution on the original Game Boys were pretty low, so it doesn't take a lot of hardware to emulate them pretty well. And this generation's console does seem to get the job done for pretty much all the Game Boy systems, including the Advance. I'm about to play some Advance games, and I was honestly shocked. I didn't think that it could run the Advance as well as it does.
Sonia. Round one. Fight! Sonia wins. Round two. Fight!
So what's the bottom line on the Retrobit Generations game console? Well, out of the box, the thing's a total pile of shit. It's probably one of the worst game consoles ever made. I'd say this game console is on the same level as the TigerGame.com, which was also another fiasco. The SD card slot is really the only thing that saved this thing from ending up in a landfill. The ability to emulate games, even if it doesn't do it well, for the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Nintendo Game Boy, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance are really the only redeeming features. That's really the only upside to this particular unit. The 100 popular arcade titles that they brag about on the box, those titles are a complete waste of time on this hardware. Most of the games you'd actually want to play are just too intense to run on this particular hardware. But if you're ever walking around a garage sale or a thrift store and you see this thing for $5 or less, and you just want to play some Nintendo or Game Boy games, there are worse things you could do with that $5. In that situation, even if you just want to put it up on the shelf as a collectible, I'd say it's... I'm not going to go as far as recommend it, but you know, you could spend the $5 instead of going for 4 for 4 at Wendy's. That's all I'm saying. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive on the Retrobit Generations. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.